Shalom, shalom, everybody. All praise to the Most High. The Holy
Shalom,
Spirit
everyone.
inside of Elderess Janus Clark is going to give us some good word. So I'm going to turn it into the hands of Elderess Janus Clark. You have the floor.
Okay. All right. Shalom, everyone. I'm in the book of Jasher in the Sefer Bible. Today is November 23, 2022. And I'm starting at chapter 12. This is our third reading. And it goes as thus. And when the king heard the words of Abram, he ordered him to be put into prison. And Abram was 10 days in prison. And at the end of those days, the king ordered that all the kings, princes, and governors of different provinces and the sages should come before him. And they sat before him, and Abram was still in the house of confinement. Abram. And the king said to the princes and sages, have you heard about Abram, the son of Terah, has done to his father? Thus has he done to him, and I ordered him to be brought before me. And thus has he spoken. His heart did not misgive him, neither did he stir in my presence. And behold, now he is confined in prison. Therefore, decide what judgment is due to this man who reviled the king, who spoke and did all the things that you heard. And they all answered the king, saying, the man who revels the king should be hanged upon a tree. But having done all the things that he said, and having despised our Elohim, he must therefore be burned to death. For this is the law in this matter. And it pleases the king to do this. Let him order his servants to kindle a fire both night and day in your brick furnace, and then we will cast this man into it. And the king did so. And he commanded his servants that they should prepare a fire for 3 days and 3 nights in the king's furnace, that is, Adizim. And the king ordered them to take Abram from prison and bring him out to be burned. And all the king's servants, princes, Adoniam, governors, and judges, and all the inhabitants of the land, about 900,000 men, stood opposite the furnace to see Abram. And all the women and little ones crowded upon the roofs and towers to see what was doing with Abram. And they all stood together at a distance, and there was not a man left that did not come on the day to behold the scene. And when Abram was come, the conjurers of the king and the sages saw Abram, and they cried out to the king, saying, our sovereign Adonai, surely this is the man whom we know to have been the child at whose birth the great star swallowed the 4 stars, which we declared to the king now 50 years since. And behold, now his father has also transgressed your commands and mocked you by bringing you another child, which you did kill. And when the king heard those words, he was exceedingly wroth, and he ordered Terah to be brought before him. And the king said, have you heard what the conjurers have spoken? Now tell me truly, how did you, and you shall speak truth, you shall be acquitted. And seeing that the king's anger was so much kindled, Terah said to the king, my Adonian king, you have heard the truth, and what the sages have spoken is right. And the king said, how could you do this thing? To transgress my orders and to give me a child that you did not beget, and to take value for him. And Terah answered the king, because my tender feelings were excited for my son at that time. And I took a son of my handmaid, and I brought him to the king. And the king said, who advised you do this? Tell me, do not hide aught from me, and then you shall not die. And Terah was greatly terrified in the king's presence, and he said to the king, it was Haran, my eldest son, who advised me to this. And Haran was in those days that Abram was born 230 years old. But Haran did not advise his father to do anything. For Terah said this is to the king in order to deliver his soul from the king, for he feared greatly. And the king said to Terah, Haran, to this, your son who advised you to this shall die through the fire with Abram, for the sentence of death is upon him for having rebelled against the king's desire in doing this thing. And Haran at that time felt inclined to follow the way of Abram, but he kept it within himself. And Haran said in his heart, Behold, now the king has seized Abram on account of these things which Abram did. And it shall come to pass that if Abram prevail over the king, I will follow him. But if the king prevail, I will go after the king. And when Terah has spoken this to the king concerning Haran his son, the king ordered Haran to be seized with Abram. And they brought them both, Abram and Haran his brother, to cast him into the fire. And all the inhabitants of the land, and the king's servants and princes, and all the women and little ones were there, standing that day over them. And the king's servants took Abram and his brother, and they stripped him of all their clothes, excepting their lower garments, which was upon them, excepting their lower garments, which were upon them. And they bound their hands and feet with linen cords, and the servants of the king lifted them up and cast them both into the furnace. And Yahuwah loved Abram, and he had compassion over him. And Yahuwah came down and delivered Abram from the fire, and he was not burned. But all the cords with which they bound him were burned. And while Abram remained and walked about in the fire, and Haran died, cast him into the fire. And he was burned to ashes, for his heart was not perfect with Yahuwah. And those men who had cast him into the fire, the flame of the fire spread over them, and they were burned, and 12 men of them died. And Abram walked into the midst of the fire 3 days and 3 nights, and all the servants of the king saw him walking in the fire. And they came and told the king, saying, Behold, we have seen Abram walking about in the midst of the fire, and even the lower garments which are upon him are not burned, but the cord which he was bound is burned. And when the king heard those words, his heart fainted, and he would not believe them. So he sent other faithful princes to see this matter. And they went and saw it and told it to the king. And the king rose to go and see it. And he saw Abram walking to and fro in the midst of the fire. And he saw Haran's body burned. And the king wondered greatly. And the king ordered Abram to be taken out from the fire, and his servants approached to take him out, and they could not. For the fire was round about, and the flames ascending toward them from the furnace. And the king's servants fled from him. And the king rebuked them, saying, Make haste and bring Abram out of the fire, that you shall not die. And the servants of the king again approached to bring Abram out. And the flames came upon him and burned their faces, so that 8 of them died. And when the king saw that his servants could not approach the fire, lest they should be burned, the king called to Abram, O servant of the Elohim who is in heaven, go forth and from amidst the fire, and come hither before me. And Abram hearkened to the voice of the king. And he went forth from the fire and came and stood before the king. And when Abram came out, the king and all his servants saw Abram coming before the king, and with his lower garments upon him, for they were not burned, but the cord with which he was bound was burned. And the king said to Abram, How is it that you were not burned in the fire? And Abram said to the king, The Elohim of heaven and earth, in whom I trust, and who has all in his power, he delivered me from the fire into which you did cast me. And Haran, the brother of Abram, was burned to ashes, and they sought for his body, and they found it consumed. And Haran was 82 years old when he died in the fire of Kadesium. And the king, princes, and inhabitants of the land, seeing that Abram was delivered from the fire, they came and bowed down. And Abram said to them, do not bow down to me, but bow down to Elohim of the world, who made you and serve you, and go in his ways, for he is he who delivered me from out of this fire. And it is he who created the souls and ruach of all men, and formed man in his mother's womb, and brought him forth into the world. It is he who will deliver those who trust in him from all pain. And this thing seemed very wonderful in the eyes of the king and princes, that Abram was saved from the fire that Haran was burned. And the king gave Abram many presents, and he gave him two head servants from the king's horses. The name of one was Onai, and the name of the other was Eleazar. And all the king's princes and servants gave Abram many gifts of silver, gold, and pearl. And the king and his princes sent him away, and he went in peace. And Abram went forth from the king in peace, and many of the king's servants followed him. About 300 men joined him. And Abram returned on that day and went to his father's house. And he and the men had followed him, and Abram served Yeshua Elohim all the days of his life. And he walked in his ways and followed his Torah. And from that day forward, Abram inclined the hearts of the sons of men to serve Yahuwah. And at that time, Nahor and Avram took unto themselves women, the daughters of their brothers Haran, the woman of Nahor of Milcah, and the name of Abram's woman was Sarah. And Sarai, the woman of Abram, was barren, and she had no offspring in those days. And at the expiration of 2 years from Abram's going out of the fire, that in the 52nd year of his life, behold, King Nimrod sat in Babel upon the throne. And the king fell asleep and dreamed that he was standing with his troops and hosts in a valley opposite the king's furnace. And he lifted up his eyes and saw a man in his likeness of Abram coming forth from the furnace, and that he came and stood before the king with his drawn sword, and then sprang to the king with his sword. And when the king fled from the man, and he was afraid, for he was afraid, and while he was running, the man threw an egg upon the king's head, and the egg became a great river. And the king dreamed that all his troops sank in that river and died. And the king took flight with 3 men who were before him and escaped. And the king looked at these men, and they were clothed in princely dresses as the garments of kings, and had the appearance and majesty of kings. And while they were running, the river again turned to an egg before the king, and there came forth from the egg a young bird, which came before the king and flew at his head and plucked out the king's eye. And the king was grieved at the sight. And he awoke of his sleep, and his ruach was agitated, and he felt a great terror. And in the morning the king rose from his couch in fear, and he ordered all the wise men and magicians to come before him. And when the king related his dream to them, and a wise servant of the king, whose name was Anuku, Anaku, answered the king, saying, this is nothing else but the evil of Abram and his seed, which will spring up against my Adoni and the king in the latter days. And behold, the day will come when Abram and his seed and the children of the household will war with my king, and they will smite all the king's hosts and his troops. And as to what you have said concerning 3 men, which you did see like unto yourself, and which you did escape, this means that only you will escape with these 3 kings from the kings of the earth, who will be with you in battle. And that which you saw of the river, which turned to an egg at first, and the young bird plucking out your eye, this means nothing but else but that the seed of Abram, which will slay the king in latter days. This is my king's dream, and this is its interpretation. And the dream is true, and the interpretation which your servant has given you is right. Now, therefore, my king, surely you know that it is now 50 years, is 52 years since your sages saw this at the birth of Abram. And it is my king who will suffer Abram to live in this earth, and it will be the injury of my Adoni and king for all the days that Abram lived. Neither you nor your kingdom will be established. For this was known formerly at his birth. And why would not my king slay him, that his evil may be kept from you in latter days? And Nimrod hearkened to the voice of Anuku, and he sent some of his servants in secret to go and seize Abram and bring him before the king to suffer death. And Eleazar, Abram's servant, whom the king had given him, was at that time in the presence of the king, and he heard what Anihu had advised the king and what the king had said to cause Abram's death. And Eleazar said to Abram, hasten, rise up, and save your soul, that you may not die through the hands of the king. But thus he did see in a dream concerning you, and thus did Anihu interpret it. And thus also did Anihu advise the king concerning you. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Eleazar, and Abram hastened and ran for safety to the house of Noash, and his son Shem. And he concealed himself there and found a place of safety. And the king's servant came to Abram's house to seek him, but they could not find him. And they searched throughout the country, and he was not to be found. And they went and searched in every direction, and he was not to be met with. And when the king's servants could not find Abram, they returned to the king. But the king's anger against Abram was stilled, as they did not find him. And the king drove from his mind this matter concerning Abram. And Abram was concealed in Noah's house for 1 month, until the king had forgotten the matter. But Abram was still afraid of the king, and Terosh came to see Abram his son secretly in the house of Noah. And Terosh was very great in the eyes of the king. And Abram said to his father, do you not know that the king thinks to slay me and to annihilate my name from the earth by the advice of his wicked counselors? Now whom have you here, and what have you in this land? Arise, let us go together to the land of Canaan, that we may be delivered from his hand, lest you perish also through him in the latter days. Do you not know, or have you not heard, that it is not through love that Nimrod gives you all this honor, but it is only for his benefit that he bestows all this good upon you? And if you do unto your greater good than this, surely these are only vanities of the world, for wealth and riches cannot avail in a day of wrath and anger. Now was Lot his brother's son, and all belonging to him. And Yahuwah again appeared to Abram and said, to your seed will I give this land, and be there built an altar to Yahuwah to appear to him, which is still to this day in the plains of Mamre. Chapter 14. In those days, there was in the land of Shinar a wise man who had understanding and all wisdom, and of a beautiful appearance, but he was poor and indigent, and his name was Requayon, and he was hard to set to support himself, and he resolved to go to Mistraim, to Orwisis, the son of Ananiam, king of Egypt, to show the king his wisdom, for perhaps he might find grace in his sight, to raise up and give his maintenance. And Requanim did so. And when Requayon came to Egypt, he asked the inhabitants of Egypt concerning the king. And the inhabitants of Egypt told him that the custom of the king of Egypt was For it was then the custom of the king of Egypt that he went from his royal palace and was seen abroad only one day in the year. And after that, the king would return to his palace to remain there. And on the day when the king went forth, he passed judgment in the land, and everyone having a suit came before the king that day to obtain his request. And when Raquaon heard of the custom in Egypt, that he could not come into the presence of the king, he grieved greatly and was very sorrowful. And in the evening, Raquaon went out and found a house in ruins, formerly a bake house in Egypt, and he abode there all night in bitterness of soul and pinched with hunger. And sleep was removed from his eyes. And Raquaon considered within himself what he should do in the town until the king made his appearance, and now he might maintain himself there. And he rose in the morning and walked about and met in his way those who sold vegetables and various sorts of seed with which they supply the inhabitants. And Raquaon wished to do the same in order to get a maintenance in the city, but he was unacquainted with the custom of the people, and he was like a blind man among them. And he went and obtained vegetables to sell them for his support. And the rabble assembled about him and ridiculed him and took his vegetables from him and left him nothing. And he rose up from there in bitterness of soul, and went sighing to the bakehouse in which he had remained all night before. And he slept there the second night. And on that night again he reasoned within himself how he could save himself from starvation, and he devised a scheme how to act. And he rose up in the morning and acted indigenously, and went and hired 30 strong men of the rabble, carrying their war instruments in their hand, and he led them to the top of Egypt's sepulchre, and he placed them there. And he commanded them, saying, Thus says the king, strengthen yourself and be violent men, and let no man, that valiant men, and let no man be buried here until 200 pieces of silver be given, and then he may be buried. And those men did according to the order of Requiem to the people of Egypt the whole of that year. And in 8 months' time, Raquaon and his men gathered great riches of silver and gold. And Raquaon took a great quantity of horses and other animals, and he hired men, war men, and he gave them horses, and they remained with him. And when the year came around, at the time the king went forth into the town, all the inhabitants of Egypt assembled together to speak to him concerning the work of Requayon and his men. And the king went forth on the appointed day, and all Egypt came before him and cried unto him, saying, May the king live forever. What is this thing that you do in the town to your servants? Not to suffer a dead body to be buried until so much silver and gold be given. Was there ever the like unto this done in the whole earth from the days of former kings? And yea, even from the days of Adam and unto this day, that the dead should not be buried only for a set price. We know it to be a custom of kings to take a yearly tax from the living, but you do not only do this, but from the dead also you exact tax day by day. Now, O king, we can no more bear this, for the whole city is ruined on this account. And do you not know it? And when the king heard all that they had spoken, he was very wroth, and his anger burned within him at this affair, for he had known nothing of it. And the king said, Who and where is he that dares to do this wicked thing in my land without my command? Surely you will tell me. And they told him all the works of Raquaon and his men, and the king's anger was aroused, and he ordered Raquaon and his men to be brought before him. And Raquaon took about 1,000 children, sons and daughters, and clothed them in silk and embroidery, and he set them upon horses and sent them to the king by means of his men. And he also took a great quantity of silver and gold and precious stones, and a strong and beautiful horse as a present for the king, with which he came before the king and bowed down to the earth before him. and the king, his servants, and all the inhabitants of Egypt wondered at the works of Requiem, and they saw his riches and the presents that he had brought to the king. And it greatly pleased the king, and he wondered at it. And when Requiem sat before him, the king asked him concerning all his words. And Requiem spoke all his words wisely before the king, his servants, and all the inhabitants of Egypt. And when the king heard the words of Requiem and his wisdom, Requiem found grace in his sight, and he met with grace and kindness from all the servants of the king and from all the inhabitants of Egypt on account of his wisdom and excellent speeches. And from that time, they loved him exceedingly. And the king answered and said to Requiem, your name shall no more be Requiem, but Pharaoh shall be your name, since you did exact a tax from the dead. And he called his name Pharaoh. And the king and his subjects loved Requiem for his wisdom, and they consulted with all the inhabitants of Egypt to make him perfect under the king. And all the inhabitants of Egypt and his wise men did so, and it was made a law in Egypt. And they made Requiem Pharaoh perfect under Ahasuerus, king of Egypt. And Requiem Pharaoh governed over Egypt, daily administering justice to the whole city. But Ahasuerus, the king, would judge the people of the land one day in the year, and when he went out to make his appearance. And Requiem, Pharaoh cunningly usurped the government of Egypt, and he exacted a tax from all the inhabitants of Egypt. And when all the inhabitants of Egypt greatly loved Requiem Pharaoh, they made a decree to call every king that should reign over them, their seed in Egypt, Pharaoh. Therefore, all the kings that reign in Egypt from that time forward were called Pharaoh until this day. That's the end of chapter 14. We will start again another day on chapter 15. And this is all for now. Shalom.